introduce my friend and colleague, Lord Andrew Adonis, who, as you know, chairs the National Infrastructure Commission, and he certainly should have some of the answers that we're seeking. So, Andrew, no pressure, tell us the answers.
It's great to be here today, and also to be with Mayor Andy Street, who's double hatting. He's speaking at about 3 different conferences here this morning, launching them all on behalf of the West Midlands, which of course is a great hive of activity. And when you see what's happened to the National Exhibition Centre and what will happen to it when, as Andy put it, UK Central opens, which is now only 9 years away. It'll be opening in 2026, and will combine not only the hub of the National Motorway Network, which of course focuses here, but also Birmingham International Station, the airport, which the Mayor of the West Midlands has described now as the 5th London airport. Well, if the Mayor of the West Midlands describes it like that, I'm sure that will catch on as a slogan quite fast. And of course the HS2 stations. It's become the most massive transport hub and centre for development across the country. The advent of the new mayors, because of course the Mayor of London was launched nearly 20 years ago now, but Andy, as the Mayor of the West Midlands, is the first of this new generation of metro mayors, is hugely important in terms of planning regional infrastructure. And the vision that you heard from Andy just now, which of course will link into Highways UK, to Network Rail, to all of the big transport planners nationally, I think will give a very welcome regional focus to the planning of our transport networks that frankly we haven't had over the last generation. We've had it in London with Transport for London, and that's been a big impetus to the development of transport networks in the capital, including huge innovation like the congestion zone in London, the low emissions zone that's being introduced now, and big public transport developments, a doubling of the bus network, the introduction of the first citywide system of segregated cycle lanes, which you've had in London as a result of the Mayor. And Andy, I expect, will take forward a lot of innovations of that kind in partnership with you over the coming years, as will the new Metro Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and equivalent mayors who are being set up across the country. So I see this as a hugely important innovation, and one which gives you great opportunities to work in partnership with these regional mayors to develop regional plans and very bold innovations in transport and road planning over the next generation. Now, Birmingham has always been the home to these developments. When I was Secretary of State for Transport, one of the first engagements I undertook was to come to the Motorway Control Centre, the Highways, as then called Highways England, Control Centre in Birmingham, to see all the planning that was taking place there, and in particular, the first stretch of what was then experimental managed motorways, one junction of the M6, which at that stage was hugely controversial, this idea that we might not need the conventional hard shoulder and it could be turned into a running lane with technology to manage accidents but also to control speeds and regulate flow. That's now standard practice across motorways, one of the biggest investment programmes that's being undertaken by Highways UK and Highways England is the introduction of managed motorways across the motorway network, and is a prime example of innovation. I regret to say it's not innovation that was born here in the UK. My parliamentary colleague John Speller, who was a predecessor as Minister of State for Transport, visited the Netherlands, and they introduced the equivalent of managed motorways, that is bringing in hard shoulders as running lanes 10 years before it reached our radar at all. And it was his visit that got him onto it at the time. And it's quite a telling instance of how conservative we can often be when it comes to innovation. At the time, the Highways Agency was strongly opposed. It was thought that there were serious risk factors associated with discarding the hard shoulder and bringing it in as a running lane. And when I was Minister, there were still great running battles with the Highways Agency about the experiment in Birmingham and extending it more widely. And the argument which John had used and which I used consistently is, well, The Netherlands is in many ways the most advanced country in the world when it comes to transport planning and transport systems. If they've managed to make this work for a decade and it's been safe, then on the face of it, our presumption should be that it can work, not that it can't work. It's no accident that the Netherlands has also been at the forefront of planning for not only congestion charging, as was, but also road pricing. For the last 20 years, successive Dutch governments have had commitments to introduce a national road pricing scheme. And it was partly because the Dutch had committed to it that my predecessor as Transport Secretary, Alistair Darling, committed in principle to seeking to take forward a road pricing scheme in England too. And my view of road pricing has always been that about 5 to 10 years after the Dutch have made it work successfully, we should introduce it here. Once they've got through all the teething problems and all the technological issues and all of that, then it'll be the time for us to do it. Indeed, I remember meeting both the Dutch and the Danish ministers for transport when I was Transport Secretary, because we were then debating how bold we should be on the issue of road pricing. And I said to the Danish minister, because they'd also had a commitment to introducing road pricing, when are you intending to introduce road pricing in Denmark? And he said to me, it's very simple, Lord Adonis, we will introduce it 5 years after the Dutch. He said, but the Dutch had just put back their scheme from 2020 to 2025, and I think it's now been put back to 2030. So if things work according to plan, the Dutch will introduce road pricing at about 2030, the Danes in about 2035, and I look forward to you collectively and my good friends in Highways England to introducing a national road pricing scheme at around 2040, about 10 years after the Dutch have made it work successfully, and I look forward to seeing the plans in due course. So innovation is important, and to be absolutely blunt, I don't think if you look at it internationally, we've been at the forefront of innovation. The Netherlands, Scandinavia and Germany have been much bolder when it comes to most aspects of technology applied to road systems than we have, and I think it's a big challenge for us. And the National Infrastructure Commission, a good part of whose job is to foster innovation. We're about to launch, in partnership with Innovate UK, a competition, an innovation competition for bold innovation in road planning and highways operations over the next generation. There are many people here who I think have big contributions which they could make to that, and I look forward to your entering it, and I hope that we can get out of that some really significant forward thinking over the next generation. The only other thing I want to say is about the planning of spending on the national roads network, because the biggest single problem I think we faced in investment and modernisation of our national highway system over the last generation, basically since we completed the motorway system in the 1980s, is a stop-go mentality when it comes to investments. I was very conscious of it when I was Secretary of State, where our forward planning for the national highways system was basically the next spending review period, which was essentially 3 years. And I was even more acutely aware of it after the 2010 election, when half of the projects which were advancing when I was Secretary of State were just cancelled overnight by the incoming government in 2010 in the big axing of capital projects that took place. And the reason why, it's very important to understand what happened, the reason why the roads programme was cut back so dramatically after 2010 is it didn't have the protection of an independent statutory agency in the way that the railways did, with Network Rail and the 5-year control period, which had a statutory basis to it that had been established in the railways, and with Transport for London, which is the single biggest consumer of national railway investments outside Network Rail, again having a statutory protection and of course also the protection of the Mayor of London. It was very hard to cut programmes like Crossrail, HS2 and rail investment programmes, so roads bore the brunt of the cuts. And the cuts were extremely savage, and they included massively important programmes like the modernisation of the A14, which is the principal artery between the eastern coastal ports and the big distribution centres in the Midlands, very close to where we are today, which was cut overnight, having been previously cancelled twice before, since the scheme had been first generated 20 years before. And even after all of the statutory notices have been published. And if you look at what's happened with those schemes since, it's a very sorry story. The A14 was cancelled. It was then revived as potentially a privately funded scheme with tolls. There was the best part of 3 years spent trying to test that as a proposition before finally the scheme was put back as in much the same basis as it had been in 2010. And only now have we got to a situation where, with the establishment of Highways England and adopting basically the same 5-year planning and independent planning, statutory planning process for the highways that we have for Network Rail, is there some protection for the roads programme, and Highways England is actually able to plan with you and those people who deliver roads programmes across the next generation. And that's why we've had a really significant increase in spending on highways, the 15.2 billion capital investment with 100 schemes over what's called RIS1, the 5-year period that we're in at the moment, and much greater security for planning the next 5 years too. You should regard that as a huge opportunity. This gives a bigger pipeline of projects and greater security of funding than we've had at any time in the recent past for highways. And it also provides a backdrop against which it's possible to start thinking about bold innovations in the development of the highways network, including bold ideas like road pricing over the next generation. And if you read the reports which the National Infrastructure Commission published 3 weeks ago, our draft National Infrastructure Plan, which is centred around the 3 Cs, congestion, capacity and carbon, what that seeks to do is to put on the table some very significant forward-looking innovations in the way that we handle congestion, capacity and carbon, including road pricing, which I think may be a debate whose time has come. So I hope today you'll look at the big pipeline that there is for projects, how you can help deliver them much more efficiently in the past because you can plan over a longer time horizon with an independent agency which you now have, which has a statutory basis and much more secure funding than there's been available in the past, but also look to really significant innovations. And we set out some of them in the draft National Infrastructure Plan that was published 3 weeks ago, but I look forward to your engaging in the innovation competition we're about to launch, and I hope in partnership with Highways England we'll see some bold innovations that, as the Mayor of the West Midlands just said, will lead to much greater efficiency in the development of the road network, big reductions in emissions and pollution, and much improved service to motorists in terms of reductions of congestion, the application of technology to the road system, and the reliability of the strategic roads network. That's why we're all gathered here today. It's why we're having breakout sessions of this kind, which seek to raise the debate from the immediate issues of delivery to much longer-term strategic and innovation issues. And it's why I'm delighted to be with you this morning. Thank you very much.